My sister's over here telling me I need to move. Am I okay? Am I good right here? I can turn. Look, I see you. I won't forget you guys are over there. I'll slide it this way so I'm a little. Yeah. I'm trying to bring the action to you guys, so. You're good. Come on in. We hadn't started. Let a few more folks trickle in here. Awesome. All right. Thanks for being here. Excited to continue our study of the Proverbs that we've been doing this summer. We just wrapped up a really fun vacation Bible school week this last week. I think the kids all had a blast, and all the teachers and helpers are recovering. But I think everything went over really well, and there's a lot of great enthusiasm and momentum that came out of that. So really, really excited about that. Before we get going this morning, I've asked Don to just lead us in a word of prayer as we start our study. All right. Well, you can see from our screen this morning, we're continuing our study of the book of Proverbs. And today's topic is poverty and wealth. So far, I think the topics we've covered so far through the summer, we've talked about the family, we've talked about spirituality, sobriety, pride and humility, and we talked about the tongue and our speech. And today we're going to talk about money today. So a little different, probably something we don't talk all that much about, I feel like. In kind of our worship and Bible study setting, but I think it's going to be a really good discussion. When you think about the Bible, when I was kind of getting ready, preparing for this a few weeks ago, kind of starting preparation, you start thinking about the Bible, and when money comes up in the Bible, it comes up a lot. It comes up an awful lot, and I'm going to ask you guys some questions in a minute, but God has a great deal to say in His Word about our finances and how we're supposed to think about those things, how we're supposed to use those things, and how we're supposed to guard ourselves against those things. Just quick basic word search, right? I know some of these words in context may not exactly fit with what we're talking about, but the word rich, if you just search that in the Bible, it comes up 169 times, and the word poor actually comes up 178 times. So just in context, talking about wealth and kind of the haves and have-nots comes up a lot, quite a bit. So we're going to talk about some of those things, but just as we get started here, when you think about the Bible and, if I just were to throw at you, what are maybe some phrases or stories or people that really jump out in your mind when you think about money in the Bible, what kind of comes to maybe your mind? Some examples. Job? What do we know about Job? He was probably one of the wealthiest people that we know of in the Bible. He had just, when you see kind of the things he had, and just great wealth, and Satan, as they kind of are duking it out over Job, he even makes the point that, hey, Job's got everything. Job, there's nothing Job doesn't have that he could want. So that's a great example.
I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones.
Right. Parable, yes. Yeah, and parables come up a lot. There's probably some other parables. What are some other examples you guys can think of? Rich man and Lazarus. Yeah, and we're not specifically going to spend a lot of time out of the teachings of Jesus because we're really trying to stay kind of here in the Proverbs, but there's a bunch of teachings that Jesus had that had to do with money and finances and the way we think about those things. Absolutely. Rich young ruler. Yep. Yeah, and that's like a very specific example of this part of this problem personified, of part of the dangers that come along with these things. Yeah. We'll get there. right? Yep. I'm going to mention that one a little bit more specifically. Yeah, but that's a great one. Yeah.
The prodigal son.
Prodigal son. What's going on in that story?
He asked for his portion and he took all his wealth and squandered it, and then became the poorest of the poor, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then went back to his father's household and was received back.
Yeah, basically asked for his inheritance early and took it and wasted it and was basically the poorest of the poor, and then came back and his father, embraced him and took him back in. Yeah, absolutely. Any other ones? I mean, there's a ton.
Talents.
Parable of talents. Yeah, I'm going to mention that one here too, for sure.
The way Jesus taught, Zacchaeus is a great example. I mean, he touches Zacchaeus' heart and he's giving everything back. But multiple of Jesus' teaching have to do with take what's real, take what's right, leave this here in the world where it belongs.
Yeah, Zacchaeus was on my list when I was thinking about it. Zacchaeus was a wealthy man. I mean, the Bible talks about that, and then we see the transformation in his life afterwards, for sure. You had one.
The poor woman who gave all she had.
Yes, that was on my list too. I was trying to think, there's a lot of wealthy people that we can kind of think of by name, and I was trying to think who are the poor people that the Bible talks about? And obviously there's a lot, but usually the poor people are kind of not named. And she's not really named, but she's at least kind of singled out, and that's a great example, yeah. Any others?
Just in general, during the time of Solomon, 1 Kings 10:27, it says, the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees abundant as the sycamore. So the wealth of Solomon was just phenomenal.
And you see kind of when we kind of think about the trajectory of Israel and kind of that was the golden era of kind of, and when they even, still kind of looking back on it, that was, golden era, no pun intended, but it's yeah, I mean, that was the time where it was just, the nation was just, God had blessed the nation and everything, and then we see kind of where things went off the rails after that. It's, kind of interesting what happens there.
The poor, the Christians sold what they had to give it to
Yes. I'm going to bring that up again too. No, these are great. I mean, we could go on and on. I mean, there's just, when you do kind of realize, oh yeah, the Bible has a lot to say about this particular topic. I mean, we could go a lot of different directions. I'll try to do my best to kind of rein things in, but just rattling a few off here. We mentioned some of these, but prodigal son, the dishonest manager, really the sower, and if we think about kind of the one soil type there that where basically the riches of the world kind of crowded out the growth of that plant. Pearl of great price. We mentioned the rich man and Lazarus. If you think about the Sermon on the Mount, what was kind of the end of what you mentioned, Carrie? There's kind of a phrase, though, that maybe we can think about when we think about money. What did Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount there, talking about that? Laying up treasures in heaven, but he kind of ends that talking about who we can serve. Yeah, you can't serve God and mammon, or you can't serve God and money. And that was kind of part of what he talked about there. Rich young ruler, the widow's offering. What about Jesus going into the temple? What was he doing in the temple when he went in there? He was flipping over the tables, the money changers. I mean, again, it goes on and on. Jesus talking about rendering unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar when they were kind of grilling him about paying taxes. It just comes up over and over. I was thinking about another parable. A lot of times we think about the parables of Jesus, rightfully so, but do you guys remember Nathan's parable to King David? How did that parable start? There's two men. There's a poor man and a rich man, and the rich man does not do what's right. Very interesting. Thinking about some other folks, you mentioned, we mentioned Job. I was thinking about Abraham and Lot. They basically had so much wealth and possessions that they had to move. They had to go somewhere else because they just had too much going on for them. What about Joseph in Egypt? I was thinking about Joseph in Egypt and really Daniel in Babylon. I think we have to assume those guys were pretty wealthy. They were, just by nature of their position and what they were doing. They were wealthy men. You mentioned Zacchaeus. There's the last thing I'll mention here. There was a specific man, a specific individual that was mentioned after the crucifixion of Jesus. Anybody? Joseph of Arimathea. It mentions specifically that he was a wealthy man and he took care of Jesus' tomb. Yeah, I think you get some.
The whole Jewish community were given all that country, they were given all the property, everything they wanted, and they ended up broke. And
Yeah.
And if you think of Judas, he sold the Savior for 30 pieces of silver.
Right. So again, there's just numerous places in the text where money and finances and expectations of how we're supposed to be using those things and the dangers that come along with those things just over and over and over repeatedly comes up. So when we think about the text, certainly the scriptures have a lot to say about money, but my question to you guys this morning is why? Why is that? What is it about money that makes it so prevalent in God's word that we need to be really paying attention to it?
It's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom than for a camel to go through a needle's eye. So it's Jesus implies is probably the one thing that's most likely to divert us from service to Him.
There's some inherent danger involved, right? I mean, I think we can see that, we can understand that, we need to be reminded of that. Somebody else had something over here.
If you squander it away when you really need it for something important, you don't have it.
There's just actual practical application of it too, right? I mean, besides, the spiritual danger of it, but it's just you need to be smart with it too. I mean, there's just a practical aspect of that that's important for us too. I was thinking, part of this discussion and why it's so important too is that it's just the obvious effect it has on our lives, kind of to both of those points really. Money influences our decision making. It often dictates the way we live, where we live, what we eat, how often we eat, how we dress, what we do for a living, how we're educated, how we get around for transportation. Even what we do for fun and just generally, the way we're influenced in our life. Money has a big part of that, and we're lying to ourselves if we don't believe that. I mean, it is a significant part of who we are. Right.
So when you think about things that can be challenging to the way your priorities or things that you all kind of pray to, you can't avoid it. Like you can't just say if you're an alcoholic, you will avoid alcohol 100% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that.
It's pretty hard to exist in a society without some form of currency or money to live, right? So, I mean, you have to have it, and we've got to deal with it, and we've got to find a way to deal with it in a spiritual way that's going to be good for us, for sure. I was thinking about, when we think about the word kind of wealth or somebody that's wealthy or rich, how does the world define that? If we were to ask somebody, hey, what does it mean to be wealthy? How does our society, how does the world look at that?
You're generally going to get answers like the car that you drive, the house that you live in, how much money you make. That's just the initial thing that you go to. But if you go to different countries, you're going to get very, very different answers. Like the answer to what's wealthy in America, people's opinion of it is very different
Oh, yeah.
than answer it in third world countries, for example.
I was thinking about that for sure. This whole topic, there is a bit of a sliding scale of it's kind of relative. Like millionaires probably think billionaires are wealthy, and it's well, okay, let's kind of let's get it in context for sure. Well, what else though? I mean, when you think of somebody who's wealthy, kind of what kind of picture do you get in your mind a lot of times? I'll say for me, I know this is kind of silly. I'm the first person in the history of Brentwood, if I can get this to pop up. I don't know, this clicker does not like me, Roy. I can push it as much. I think about Scrooge McDuck. So Donald Duck's uncle, right? He's so rich he can go swimming in his pool of gold coins. It's just you got to have every, kind of like we said about Job, it's just somebody that has just everything they've ever wanted, that, just money's no objection, whatever I want to go do, I can go do. And you kind of get that picture with Solomon. I mean, Solomon basically did that, and then he wrote a lot of it down about here's kind of the outcome of a lot of that. But a lot of times, I think kind of to what Colin was saying, definitely luxury and career, maybe I'd say you could probably roll in there with some kind of status or power or influence. I mean, like when we think about people in our society that are wealthy, usually it comes along with more than just money. It's kind of all these other things that kind of roll into that, of somebody of some sort of notoriety because of how much money they have. And we can think about people that are like that in the world. So it certainly plays a big influence on us. And I just want to make the point too, it's really easy to come across like in a discussion like this and make it sound like, oh, well, having money is a bad thing. Certainly, that's not the case. We've already established just in our conversation this morning, there were a lot of righteous people in the Bible that were very wealthy, and God had blessed them in those endeavors. But one of the things I wanted for us to talk about this morning is, when we think about how the world defines wealth, that's not how we should be defining the word wealth. True wealth, of course, is that how God defines true wealth in the ways we've been talking about? Absolutely not, of course not. So we need to look at God's word. We want to understand what true wealth is and how the Lord looks at that. So we're going to get into the Proverbs, and I think part of this discussion here is when we talk about true wealth and value and maybe worth, when we think about self-worth and those kinds of things, our worth is not defined by our financial status, the things we have, the way people look at us in that sense. Our worth is defined by God himself. How does God really measure the value of a person? By his heart, by our hearts, right? He's looking at it from that sense. What do you guys remember from the very beginning in Genesis? How does it describe God creating man? In his own image. Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created him. So at the outset, we're made in the very likeness and image of God. We're valuable for what we are as part of God's glorious creation, regardless of how much money is sitting in the bank. Just right off the bat, that should be a leveler for all people. And of course, thinking through that a little further, thinking about our own situation, we are broken people. We've sinned. We've all fallen short of God's glory. And even still, we are greatly loved by God. John 3:16. Anybody want to quote that for us here in the room? If we weren't worth much, would God have done that? No. So, that's where it should all start for us. Before, when we think about true wealth, when we think about the value of ourselves, I know we're really bad about comparing ourselves to other people and things like that. Oh, I don't have that much. Well, we're fundamentally we're all worth what God says we're worth. So let's talk about the Proverbs. I want to say, there were a lot of verses, that I had kind of looked at. They're tied into kind of money and finances, poverty and wealth, and this topic specifically. But I didn't just grab all of them. I tried to kind of pick a few sort of themes for us to look at as we went through today. And so, there's probably some in here that I'm missing. But our first one we'll look at, if I can get this to go. Kind of back to what you said up here, about God looks at our hearts. And really, when we think about our character, it's really about our hearts and our character. And that means so much more than how much money we have. What's more valuable to have, a good standing and reputation before God or a big bank account? Pretty obvious question to ask, but, do we think about it like that? So I'm just going to read these. Proverbs 11, verse 4 says, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. Proverbs 11:28, whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. Proverbs 28:6 says, better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than a rich man who is crooked in his ways. And then Proverbs 22:1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. Does it cost us any money to have a heart that's set on righteousness? No. It doesn't cost you anything from that sense. No matter of money is involved in making a decision to have a heart that's set on doing right and being righteous before the Lord. What does that require of us, though? It may not cost us money, but what does it cost us? Sacrifice to some extent, right? I mean, it's going to require something of us to live in that way for sure. Yeah.
Some of it is depending on God. You know, when we go through this life, we have to realize we need to depend on God because He will be with us. He will help us.
Absolutely. Our dependence on God is everything. I mean, it's, we've got our side of things to do, but ultimately it doesn't happen without God, right? I mean, we depend on Him, absolutely. One of the things that jumped out at me at this passage, the one there at the top especially, riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. Thinking about that, I was thinking about kind of in our world, and you hear stories of maybe corrupt judges that get paid off, by somebody that's done wrong or something like that. When we think about eternity and judgment before the Lord and that day of judgment, there's nobody that's rich enough that's going to pay off that judge. This is a judge that cannot be bought. I think that's kind of a fascinating thing to think about. It should be kind of maybe comforting for us and a little sobering as well. Why is money such a stumbling block when it comes to our salvation? I know we're kind of mentioning it back over here, I think, earlier, but why is it such a stumbling block to us? Yeah, there's another one of our passages, right, that probably comes to our mind, right? If we kind of fall in love with it or get enchanted by it, it's our downfall. I mean, it takes us, ultimately, it takes us away from the Lord. It's like an idol to us that takes us away. Yeah.
It's also insidious, because as Julie noted, you have to have some sort of resources. But then just how much is
Right.
enough and just how do I go about getting those and what do I use them for? It's just a constant set of decisions. It's really easy to fall into bad patterns.
Yeah, definitely.
And Jay, I was just saying, it takes us back to that idea where I'm able to do anything that I want. It brings you back to a total sense of selfishness, thinking that you have control over your life when you really don't. And that can lead you down a really dangerous path.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think, to your point is well taken, that it doesn't cost us anything to set our heart in the right place. But that's only partially true in our society in many situations.
Mhm.
Right? So there's lots of circumstances where you might be able to choose enriching myself or doing what's right.
Yeah.
And so depending on how you look at that, if you don't do that,
There may be sacrifice. There may be financial sacrifice involved in a decision like that, right? So, yeah, point is well taken.
and to Mom's point, I think that becomes really insidious because, it's not like somebody comes up to you and says, "Oh, it's like you can either get this money or be a bad person and separate yourself from God." It's much more insidious the way that comes. It's like this tiny little thing. You need to just cut this corner or make this decision, and it is tied to your lifestyle.
It'd be pretty easy to start rationalizing and justifying things very, very easily. Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about too, right? I mean, one of the things that's kind of obvious that there wasn't really a lot of Proverbs passage that were kind of on the nose about just the kind of temporary nature of wealth. There's lots of other passages we can think about that kind of take us there, but just thinking about how fleeting and temporary, and we think about Ecclesiastes and those kind of passages about how it's just a vapor and it's gone. I think that should be a big part of helping us understand here too, though, of the danger of getting sucked into these things where we're chasing after something that doesn't last. I mean, very point well taken to Carrie, referencing Sermon on the Mount where Jesus talks about laying up your treasures in heaven, not here on earth. I mean, that's absolutely the mentality we should have, and I think that's why Jesus has a big chunk of that sermon talking about those kinds of things, because it's really easy for us to start chasing, chasing after really physical possessions rather than kind of spiritual treasure. It takes us away from our walk with the Lord. I'm going to keep us moving here. I want to talk about some of the things that tie in with our obligations as believers, from what the text tells us that we should be doing with our money. And again, just a few passages here. We see lots of examples in other places in the text, but I'll read these. Proverbs 3, starting in verse 9, says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce." We're going to talk about honoring the Lord with our first fruits. And then these next three passages really kind of talk very specifically about how we should be thinking about the poor and the people that don't have, and how we should be trying to take care of them when there's opportunity. So Proverbs 14:31 says, "Whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him." Proverbs 19:17, "Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed." Proverbs 22:16, "Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty." I want to start with the first fruits conversation. Well, actually, I take that back. I want to start with the other three passages. When you think about Old Testament specifically, what was one thing that God really went after the Israelites for in terms of the way they were not using their money appropriately with their own people? He was very specific about something they were doing, and it was still kind of going on. Jesus talks about it a little bit when he's around to the Pharisees and some of those folks. What were they doing to their own people?
They were oppressing the poor. They weren't taking care of them. God even gave provisions in how they were to harvest. They were supposed to leave some of the harvest behind so the poor could come and glean for themselves. And they weren't doing that. They were oppressing them.
They continually were oppressing the poor. That was part of the judgment that came against them as a nation. Was they were taking advantage of people that had no way to basically fend for themselves. The provisions that God had laid out for them to be able to take care of the less fortunate that were a part of their midst, they weren't doing that. He was pretty harsh on them about those things.
One of the specific things they were forbidden to do was to charge interest when they lent someone money. They couldn't charge you interest.
Yeah.
Israelites.
What about their parents? What was one of the things Jesus kind of went after them about?
They tithed, and then they didn't take care of their own parents.
Yeah, they were not taking care of their parents, the elderly folks. They weren't people that needed help. They weren't doing what they were supposed to with their finances to take care of those people. Shame on them and shame on us if we're not looking for opportunities to do that as well. There's a lot we could go into there, but some of those passages to me just jumped out and just kind of scream, yeah, this is what we saw of God's people in the Old Testament, especially. They weren't doing these things. I want to talk about first fruits. So this passage here in Proverbs 3, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. If we go back to Old Testament, what did God lay out for the people that they were supposed to be doing with their, call it income or if they're growing crops or doing things, what were they supposed to be doing? Tithing, and just a few people here. Serving him, yeah, with their first fruits. And
They were supposed to have a feast whenever they harvested. Before they actually ate, they were supposed to give back to God first. And with so many of these feasts and these laws here, it always goes back to anything they actually had when they came to the land. It's because God gave them whatever it was. They didn't do anything for it. So all of these were supposed to be reminders of the things that they had and what they did with it because God gave it to them in the first place. And we forget that a lot.
so you,
And Jay,
yeah.
I believe when they went through the harvest, the first time to pick all their produce and their fruits and their wheat, they weren't supposed to go back through the field again to pick up the remainder. They were supposed to leave that for the poor to come
That's kind of,
and pick up. Oh, somebody already said
yeah, Colin kind of referenced that, but yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, there were things they were supposed to be doing to remember God and honor God. Wasn't happening. If you go back and read in Exodus 23, again, we've got kind of this amazing scene where the people are all kind of there at the base of Mount Sinai, and God's giving the law. And specifically in Exodus 23, he's talking about the laws of of the Sabbaths and the festivals. In Exodus 23:19, the best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God. This was stuff they were supposed to be doing. Obviously, we should be thinking about that as well. I'm not going to read it, but if you want to go make a footnote over in Nehemiah chapter 10, this, of course, is after all the people have come back from captivity, and we've got folks that are back in Jerusalem. They're kind of rededicating everything, and Ezra's reading from the law. A lot of things happening there, but part of the instruction in Nehemiah 10 is there's a pretty good chunk of scripture there where they talk about the firstborn of their livestock and the first fruits of their things they've been growing and the tithing they're supposed to be doing. And I don't know that this is necessarily stuff that God has told them to do, but they are setting this as a part of their covenant, saying these are the things we're going to do. And it's pretty impressive when you go down through and read that. So, we see examples of whether it's God giving instruction or these godly people like Nehemiah and Ezra. They understood there's an expectation to give God the best of what they had, the first fruits of the things they had. And really their failure to not do those things were a big part of why they went in captivity in the first place, as we kind of talked about. So I did want to spend some time talking about how we should be using our finances. Is God a generous God? Without question. Are we generous people? Like, if somebody was talking to somebody else about you, would they describe you as a generous person? I don't know. Right.
Like job access, like education, resources. And so it's really, really easy for me to feel like I've done my duty, but stay in a very, very comfortable place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that, we as a group of people probably could be more open about, like in our conversations with each other and ourselves about how do we make sure that we're not supporting things that oppress the poor to increase wealth.
Yeah, that's a point well taken. There's a lot of things that are out of our control when it comes to stuff like that happening. And to the best we can, try to stay out of that. We should stay out of it from the sense of not contributing towards it, right? But I think we got to be really honest with ourselves to look around. We see people in need all the time. And how do we respond in those situations? Because I think it's really easy for us to kind of brush it off or try to compartmentalize and be like, somebody else will take care of that. And then what are we doing to support people that really need help? And I was thinking about how God really tests the hearts of people who have with circumstances of people who do not have. And I know we've got a lot of folks here at Brentwood that are great, that are incredibly generous. When needs arise, things are usually taken care of very quickly. But I also want to point out here too, I think there's something to be said about kind of ad hoc requests alongside maybe also obligations that we have as people, as a part of a local body, to be routinely giving. It's one thing where, hey, this need popped over here and I'm gonna take care of that. But the routine things where are we approaching every week with the first fruits of our labor and giving that to the Lord? I think that's a really important aspect that sometimes, again, we can kind of say, well, hey, I did this over here I'm good for a while. Is that the attitude we should be having when it comes to the first fruits that we are bringing to the Lord every week as we think about our career and what we're, how the Lord's providing for us continually? Are we honoring that? Are we putting that back before the Lord and saying thank you? So I can't answer that question for each of you, but that's something, we all need to think about that. Think about how we're honoring the Lord with our first fruits.
When Israelites were to have sacrifices, they were to pick the best of their
Yeah.
animals or whatever to sacrifice. He didn't want anything less than the best.
Right. Yeah. The very best was, and very very famously we can kind of recall, God basically said, I'm not looking for your sacrifices just for the sake of sacrifices. Like, you need to have some real meaning behind it too. So, some questions for us to think about. And how do we respond? We get a bonus at work or we get a pay raise. How do we respond when that happens? Maybe again, maybe you get some kind of promotion or maybe some kind of windfall. You get that tax refund back, and you've already been thinking about what you're going to use it on. It's like Christmas vacation. I'm going to buy the pool, and then you actually don't get it. But how are we thinking about when we get that? When we know we've got something coming to us, where's our heart? Are we already thinking about how I'm going to go spend it on this thing that I want, or are we thinking about how we should be using that and honoring the Lord with it? That's something I know I could be better about. Maybe you've got a rich uncle that just passed away. I mean, it's very funny. A gentleman Dad worked with for a long time, he did have like a rich uncle that passed away, and they like inherited this like big ranch in Texas and all kind of stuff. And it's like, that's pretty cool. But most people are never going to see anything like that. But when something like that happens, are we thinking just, oh man, this is going to be awesome. I'm going to go do all this cool stuff that I've always wanted to do? Or are we thinking about how should I be using this for the benefit of God's kingdom? Yeah.
And you've already mentioned this, but sometimes I think we forget that, or I forget, you all may remember it every day, but that God's pattern in the Old Testament of those first fruits and those sacrifices and those regular givings were, yes, to honor him, they also supported the priests.
Yeah.
They also supported an entire tribe. So the priestly tribe and the Levites. And then everything else that people gave was for those things that you said, like ad hoc, or we have extra, and so we're giving. When they were asked for offerings for the temple, for example, or the tabernacle in previous years, they had other wealth that they tapped into. So the same patterns there, that every time we propose to give in our hearts, that's the maintenance to some degree of the work that we do. But there are other opportunities all the time.
I didn't go grab like the passages from the law, but that Nehemiah 10 passage I referenced, it does talk some about that, about how they were supposed to be tithing and how that was going to essentially support the Levites and the things they were doing. So yeah, that's a point well taken, right? And again, when we think about kind of the pattern we see through, that is, I think there's a reason from that, obviously from the Lord. What do we see in the New Testament examples of how Christians handled their money? I mean, there's a verse that comes to my mind, but I've also been looking at this.
Ephesians 4:28 tells us that it says that one who steals should steal no longer, but let him labor, doing good with his own hands, so that he can have something to share with those who need.
Yeah, I didn't grab, like, there were a good number of passages from Proverbs that talked essentially kind of around that of, basically the lazy people are going to kind of get what they get, and people that work hard will get what they get. And there were some passages around that, absolutely.
Well, in Acts, when the church was growing, everybody was selling their stuff and contributing to the church. It was just something that was completely and utterly befuddling to everybody else on the
Yeah.
outside. Like, what are you guys doing? But everybody inside was just like, we love each other and we want to help each other out.
That was the passage that I thought about. I was thinking about, that's from Acts chapter 2, and it says that the early Christians were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And it was, I think people were looking around like, what are these crazy people doing? But they were taking care of each other because they loved each other. And again, just Some things for us to think about. This is not exhaustive. The last point I wanted to make on this, if I can get it to go, is really talking about true treasure and where our treasure lies and what's really valuable. And these last Proverbs, here we go. Proverbs 3, verse 13 through 16. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom and the one who gets understanding, for the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. She is more precious than jewels, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. Proverbs 8, take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than the jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. And then lastly, Proverbs 16, how much better to get wisdom than gold? To get understanding is to be chosen rather than silver. There's this, idea here, and you guys probably talked about this in the wisdom class, but just that God's wisdom is transformational in our lives. It is so much more valuable than any physical kind of possessions or financial wealth or status or anything that we could ever possibly have. God's word, God's wisdom is the most valuable thing that we can invest in, not the S&P 500, if you want to think of it that way. And I was thinking about, kind of where does this, when we think about godly wisdom, where does godly wisdom start? Like, how do we acquire it? It's not a secret, yeah. Reading it. Yeah, reading it and taking it in and actually, employing it in our lives and making it part of who we are. I was thinking, you guys, I'm sure you probably covered this again in that wisdom class, but, Proverbs 1, we kind of get right out of the gates. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So wisdom, this godly wisdom, it starts with putting God and ourselves relative to God in the correct place. And then once we've begun that process, we're reading God's word, reading the Bible, really following the instructions that are there. This isn't some mystery. We can go and read this stuff and do it, and it's going to make our lives more meaningful. It's going to make us feel more fulfilled in what we're supposed to be doing. Won't necessarily make our lives easier from the standpoint of trials and hardships and those kinds of things, but we'll at least be able to approach those things with the right kind of frame of mind to get through them with God's help. Absolutely. How do you guys, just maybe in these last couple minutes here, how do you think wealth in our society has kind of changed the way we rely upon God? I know me and Tim were talking about this recently of just, our culture, and you guys may have seen from time to time, like the place we live in especially. I mean, we live generally in usually year to year, in the top 25 wealthiest counties in the country, in a already wealthy country of all countries. How has wealth changed the way our society feels a dependence on God, do you guys think?
There was a movie many years ago, most of you never even heard of it, called Shenandoah. And they were sitting at the table, they had a farm, they were sitting at the table, the man bowed his head and he said, I planted and I watered the crops and I reaped, he basically said, thank you anyway, God. I did all of it. And we get to the point where we rely on ourselves so much that we forget that everything we have comes from God.
Well, I think it's easy when you have the money to do something, you think, okay, I'm going to do this. I got this promotion, I got this new job, or whatever, I'm going to move my family across the country. But should you be doing that? Just because you can, just because you have the money, what if there's not a church family there? Just because you can, should you be doing that? And I think we still need to rely on God and be prayerful about what we're doing with that money, even if it's something maybe we really want. Should we be doing that?
Yeah, great comment. Not just saying that. Great comment. I was thinking about the Israelites. What can we, again, if the Old Testament is our school teacher, as Dan likes to use the phrase, when we think about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, how do we learn from them, right? How much food did God give them every day? Just enough. How satisfied would we be if we only had just enough to get by day to day?
If we're poor, we would be very happy.
Yeah. again, kind of back on our relative sliding scale, but there's a lot of people in the world that live like that. We don't live like that. And we can say thankfully, but like, I don't know, like, is that better for us? Or is that a stumbling block to us? I don't know. Did the Israelites leave Egypt empty-handed? No. What did they have?
The riches of the Egyptians.
They plundered the Egyptians. God allowed them to take basically the wealth of Egypt with them. Did that help them in the wilderness, really? Nope. It's very funny. I was thinking about this, They couldn't eat the plunder of the Egyptians, and I thought, well, they did eventually eat the plunder of the Egyptians when they ground down the golden calf and had to eat it. So they did eventually eat the plunder of the Egyptians, but it didn't help them day to day. And so, I would encourage you, go back and read, as we wrap up here, go back and read Matthew 6, Sermon on the Mount. This is back to what Carrie referenced earlier. And this is Jesus talking about not laying up for ourselves treasures on earth, but laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven. So I would encourage you, as we leave here, go back and make some time to read that. I hope this was a good study. Hopefully this was a good conversation with you guys today. Again, there's a lot of other things we could have gotten into, and I tend to ramble, so we didn't make it to as much as we could have. But thank you for your comments and your participation.